All right, welcome once again. It's the second Tuesday in September, so we're doing a lecture. I'll go ahead and recommend, if you want to see these slides, which are going to be the same as those. You might prefer over here, but you're welcome to sit anywhere you want. So this is the last of the summer lectures. We will continue October, November, December. I've got some announcements to make at the end here, and we'll be doing, one Tuesday a month, public lectures. But tonight's is on Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, and he is the newest president to be on Mount Rushmore. So it's Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and then Teddy Roosevelt. So that's probably the first thing we have to figure out is why did he get added to Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln? Why Teddy? So we'll talk about that. And also, he is just a force of nature. He wrote 30 books, and he was fluent in 6 languages. He wrote 250,000 letters that we have preserved in the archives. And he was just constantly on the go. During the first presidential campaign that he conducted himself, he gave speeches in 24 states. And it was really before the days of electronic amplification. So he's doing whistle-stop and assembly halls where all he's got is his own voice. And just mesmerize crowds. And you can see he's the first president really to be captured on film, moving pictures. You can see him gesticulating wildly with sort of a fist and pounding the lectern, and the audio quality is not very good. And what we do have of him, I'm not sure how much of an artifact of the recording it is, but he's got kind of a high, squeaky voice. And it would not work in later eras, but it apparently worked well at the time. So I've got a few pictures here to start us off. Here he is at 11 years old. He was born before the end of a Civil War, born to a very wealthy family. His grandfather was one of the 10 richest men in New York. He had lots of uncles, and so his grandfather's businesses were divided among his sons. But his father turned the business that he inherited into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. They didn't have to work. Teddy didn't have to work. He didn't have to go do anything. He could have just, been the owner of a business and a bank and real estate and collected the dividends every quarter and been one of the wealthy elite of New York City. He did go to Harvard, and we'll talk about how he got there because it's a very interesting story behind that. That is as a Harvard freshman, 1876. And then less than 10 years later, 1884, he was elected to the New York State Legislature at 26. He's one of the youngest people ever elected to the state legislature there. And in his second term, the Republicans in the New York State Legislature elected him as their minority leader after only one term. Yeah. So there he is, a little bit older at 24, 31, and 40. So there he is outfitted as a cowboy because he spent time as a rancher in the Dakotas. There he is in his 30s as a U.S. Civil Service Commissioner. He and his family lived in Washington, D.C., near DuPont Circle. And there he is at age 40, Colonel Roosevelt, outfitted for the Rough Riders, headed to Cuba. And that's all before he had really done anything in the way of a political career. And we'll talk about all of that. All right, let me say a word or two first about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which is the host for all of these lectures. Founded in 2004, so we're 21 years old. And our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And it is named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer from the last century. Pains me to say that. So in addition to sponsoring this lecture series, this is now going on 15. This is the 15th, I think. We offer a high school program We have high school students in a hybrid program that meet here 1 day a week in grades 8 through 12. We have an elementary school program for children in grades K through 7 that meets on Tuesday and Thursday, and that's actually one of the classrooms back in that corner. They had class back there today. We offer high school students an integrated chronological study of Western civilization, beginning with the ancient world and finishing with the 20th century. Yeah, I do need to update that. In the 12th grade. Our graduates have gone on to win scholarships. They have been, we have one student who got an appointment to the Air Force Academy. They've been to Gordon College, Bryan College, Covenant College, Austin Peay, all the Tennessee universities. We offer a complete science program. The only subjects we don't cover in our 1 day a week hybrid program are mathematics and foreign languages, and we've tried. And we had to conclude very quickly that you can't do a thorough mathematics course for high school students if you only are meeting with them 1 day a week. And you can't do language instruction in a foreign language if you're only meeting with them 1 day a week. So we have an arrangement with an online high school that offers 2 90-minute classes a week, and they run the full high school math program. They actually have 3 different curriculums. They do Jacobson and Sexton and Matthew C., and we encourage our students to sign up with them for Tuesday, Thursday. And they offer French, German, Spanish, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Chinese for foreign languages. And it's the largest online Christian high school in the world. And I teach German for them. So there's me. I had to update this slide because we passed our 48th wedding anniversary. We're closing in on the big 5-0. 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters, 22 grandchildren so far. And I have degrees in history. I have been a history professor, and I was city manager here in Mount Juliet for 7 years. That's a whole different life and hat. We still have a publishing company, and with my wife, I am co-director here at the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. So, help me get started. What's the most significant thing you already know about Teddy Roosevelt? Yeah, there he is. Yes, he is on Mount Rushmore. Yep, that's him.
He was shot giving a speech on the back of a train and continued, I don't know, for an hour and a half or something to finish his speech while he was sitting there bleeding.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. It was on his last campaign. But yeah, he was shot just before the speech, and he discovered, okay, here's the caveat on that, lest it seem too extreme. The bullet hit his eyeglass cases and his 50-page speech, which was folded. So it got slowed down quite a bit, but it did penetrate, and very close to one of his lungs. It didn't collapse the lung. But the doctors decided that and he refused to go to the hospital, but later on when he went to the hospital and they examined him and x-rayed, the doctor said, from the position of the bullet, we think, and your age, we think it would be too dangerous for us to operate. So he spent the rest of his life with the bullet. Yeah, I'll talk about all of that later on. So what else do you know about him? Anything? He did. Yeah, he's a great conservation champion. The first 5 national parks were established during his presidency. Of course, he also went out and shot buffalo, and then a rhinoceros. And then, he went on a big safari in Africa for a year, came back with 1,000 stuffed animals. All right. Well, good. So I'm going to be filling you in on all sorts of new stuff. All right. So how do we know? What are our sources? Here we go. Library of Congress has his papers. It's not a presidential library for Teddy Roosevelt. But the Library of Congress has 460,000 items, including 250,000 letters. He's probably the most prolific letter writer of all of our presidents. So that's available and has been available for researchers for quite some time. There are some good biographies of him, and I'll mention a couple of them. He wrote 30 books himself. including his own accounts of the Rough Riders. It actually was serialized in Scribner's in New York City as he came back from the war, and while he was running for governor, he was writing these articles, which were then turned into a book. He wrote a couple of books about his time out west in the Dakota Territory, and after his presidency, he got bored, and he wrote his own autobiography in 1913. Among the 30 books, his first book he started when he was at Harvard, published shortly after his graduation, and it remains a definitive historical study of U.S. naval power in the War of 1812. It was picked up and taught at the U.S. Naval College, and he published it when he was in his early 20s, and the research he started as an undergrad. Newspaper and magazine articles. Oh my God. The press was fascinated with him, and he understood the power of the press, and he cultivated the press. He invented the background story and the leak. He really did. He would invite the press into his office before the Oval Office was actually even built. He had an office on the second floor of the White House. He'd invite 4 or 5 newspaper reporters in and just unload and say, now, you can't print any of this. And if you print that I said it, I'll deny it and call you a liar. But here's what I'm thinking. He invented the trial balloon. He would say, I think I might do this. Go ahead and print a story and let's see how it flies. And if it didn't fly, he would say, wow, I don't know whose idea that was, but I wasn't ever really going to do that. So there are hundreds of thousands of newspapers. When he's president, it's like every newspaper in the country has a story about Teddy every day because he's always doing something. They couldn't keep up with him. It's a little bit like somebody in the White House right now. But anyway, which makes it interesting to research him. Biographies. There have been some very good ones over the last 30 years. David McCullough, if you know him, wrote a book about him called Mornings on Horseback because during his presidency, he liked to get up early in the morning and go out and do a horseback ride. And then, once or twice a week, he would gather friends and people from the diplomatic corps and say, we're going to go on a hike. But a hike with Teddy, he had a special kind of hike. He specialized in what he called point-to-point hikes. So he'd get the map out. They'd start out in Lafayette Square, or they'd maybe go up to Rock Creek, and he'd say, okay, well, here's where we are. We're going to go there. And the goal was go in a straight line no matter what the obstacles. And he wore diplomats out. I mean, lots of them just dropped by the side of, he's hacking his way through the forest and going up steep embankments and down into streams. And yeah. So McCullough wrote a book that picks up on that habit of his. Doris Kearns Goodwin, who did one of the better biographies of Lincoln, I talked about that last month. She did a biography of Roosevelt called The Bully Pulpit, which is, again, his invention. He said, the presidency is a bully pulpit. He said, the president has limited powers, but what I have is the bully pulpit. I can shape public opinion. And he did, and he knew how to use it. And then the definitive biography of him, I was showing folks before. Edmund Morris did this volume in 1979. He started because of the volumes of material he's got. This came out in 79. It's, 800 pages. Won the Pulitzer Prize. It's very well written and extremely well researched. And he got Roosevelt in this volume, I think I've got it on the screen there. Yeah, he got him up to 1901, which is basically before he was president. Well, that's just the first 800 pages. So it took a few years, and then he published the second volume, Theodore Rex, which covers just his presidency. And it's another 700 pages. And then, because he leaves the presidency as a young man and has all these adventures as an ex-president, he did a third volume called Colonel Roosevelt, which, in spite of the title, is not about the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders is before he was president. And this volume has 700 pages. So if you're into books like The Lord of the Rings, I got the series for you. And Teddy is just fascinating. Edmund Morris. He took about 79, 2000. He took about 15 years off between the first volume and the second one because Ronald Reagan read the first volume during his presidency. And this came out in 79, the year before Reagan was elected. And Reagan asked him to do his biography. And so between these two volumes, he did a biography of Reagan that's quite good. And then after he'd finished that project, he came back to Teddy and did these two volumes that came out in the last one came out in 2010. So it's only 15 years old now. Also, not scholarly biographies, but I actually relied on this one quite a bit. Albert Marin is one of my favorite historical authors. Marin is a professor of history, or was, I think he's retired now, professor emeritus of history at Yeshiva University in New York City. And he's written a series of books. 3 of his books were named Boston Globe Hornbook Honor Books. His biography of Andrew Jackson won the 2005 James Madison Book Award. He started out as a junior high school social studies teacher, where he welcomed the challenge of making history come alive for his students. He's a man after my own heart. He really writes well, and this book, like sort of all of his biographies, the text is fairly dense and fairly detailed, but it is illustrated. And so this is a great introduction. If you want to get to know more about Teddy and you don't want to wade through 2,000 pages, the Marin biography would be the one I would recommend. It is written for a high school audience. There's a good junior high biography here by Betsy Kraft, and then I've got some sort of middle school primer style. You can tell these are written for about 5th grade audience, because you can check the type size. If you've got a son or a daughter, or a niece or a nephew, or a grandson or a granddaughter, this might be a way to get them started. All right. So I'm going to do this in 7 acts. I think I can get it all done, but there's 2,000 pages of stuff. If I leave something out, it's in there. I'm going to leave a lot of stuff out. So I'm going to talk about his childhood and youth. I'm going to talk about his first marriage, first election, first child, and then tragedy in his 20s that altered the course of his life. His escape to the Dakotas, where he's a ranchman, is Act 3. Second, he comes back, second marriage, and then he gets a job with the U.S. Civil Service Commission. He lives in Washington, D.C. for 6 years. And then he gets tapped to be New York City Police Commissioner. Anybody watch Blue Bloods, Tom Selleck? Have you seen the portrait hanging on the wall in Commissioner Reagan's office? He's got the portrait of Teddy Roosevelt hanging on the wall. I'll talk about his time, because the press just loved him. I'll talk about why that was so. 1897 and 1900, he's undersecretary of the Navy, lieutenant colonel of the Rough Riders, and then elected governor of New York in 1898. I'll talk about that. So that's 5 acts. Act 6, he's elected vice president, and then only 5 months into his term as vice president, the president was assassinated, and he became president and finished the rest of the 3.5 years of McKinley's term was then Teddy Roosevelt. So we'll talk about that. And then the last act is, I got the dates wrong on that shit. Well, no, 1909. Yeah, no, that's true. After he left office, the African Safari, European Tour, Bull Moose Party, South America expedition, the death of his son Quentin in 1918 in World War I, and then he died in January of 1919. So his birth, New York City. His father was a 7th generation Knickerbocker. The Roosevelts had come to New York City when it was still New Amsterdam in the 17th century, in the 1600s. And his grandfather was one of the 10 richest men in the city. Owned a hardware business. He imported plate glass from Europe. He had investments, stocks. He was a bank director, and he owned lots of real estate across Manhattan. His mother was Martha Bullock of Roswell, Georgia, because his father was on a business trip to the South and attended a ball in Roswell and met this belle of the prominent family of the city. Roswell's a suburb of Atlanta now, but it's just north of Atlanta, and fell in love with her, courted her, married her, and brought her back to New York City. And that has interesting implications for Teddy's character. His father grew the glass business, which he inherited from his grandfather, and became a millionaire in his own right, and didn't have to work. In fact, devoted quite a lot of his time to charitable causes. His father founded the Newsboys Lodging House, where he spent every Sunday evening for homeless children. He's also one of the founders of the Children's Aid Society and the New York Orthopedic Hospital. So his father's a philanthropist and devoted to charity. And they have a very elegant home. And he has 3 siblings. He's second. He has an older sister and a younger brother and a younger sister. His father supported the Union from 1861 to 1865. His mother supported the Confederacy because her family's in Georgia. And his uncles, on his mother's side, were officers in the Confederate Navy and commanded blockade runners. And his mother collected medical supplies to ship to the Army in the South, in New York City. His father was a friend of Lincoln, visited the White House, knew Lincoln and members of his cabinet, and arranged for an allotment system whereby soldiers wouldn't be paid in cash, but they could designate a portion of their pay to be sent to their families at home, because otherwise they were likely to lose it all. Most of them did. So his father wanted to enlist, and his mother wouldn't hear of it because he would wind up getting shot by one of her relatives, or he would wind up killing one of her relatives. So she said no. Yeah, friend of the Lincolns. His childhood. He was homeschooled. Not unusual for wealthy families and wealthy children in New York in the late 1800s. He had tutors at home. He was taught actually by one of his aunts. One of his mother's sisters came and lived with them and taught all 4 of the children to read and worked them through all of their disciplines with his older sister Anna and his younger brother and sister Elliot and Corinne. He did very early on in his life begin to suffer from asthma attacks, for which there was no treatment at the time. And they were terrifying. When he'd have an asthma attack, he'd get short of breath. He said it was the experience of feeling like you were drowning. And his father was very protective of him, but would not allow any of the quack doctors and their crazy ideas. The only thing he admitted to using was something one friend of his who was a physician recommended, which was coffee and cigar smoke. And actually, the caffeine has a dilatory effect, and the cigar smoke is actually soothing. Believe it or not, it actually does work for an asthma attack. So his father would get him up when he was having an asthma attack in the night. His father would bundle him up, take him out, put him in the carriage, and they would ride through the streets of New York so that he could get the cool air. And then make him coffee and give him a cigar. Yeah, but his father, he had absolutely glorious memories of his father. He says his father was the greatest man he ever knew. His father would take him to the charitable dinners and to the hospital and to all of the places where he was a philanthropist. And he said he never heard his father raise his voice. But because he was of somewhat frail health, he developed the habit of escaping into books. And then he discovered the natural world and became a collector of animal specimens. He had a collection that rivaled the Museum of Natural History. In fact, he called it the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. His statue used to stand outside the New York Museum of Natural History until the woke era demanded that it be taken down, which is a great tragedy. By the time he was 11, he had over 1,000 animals and insects and a dozen live pets. Snakes, frogs, turtles, mice. Yeah, visitors to the household never knew what they might encounter at the dinner table. And his siblings didn't much care for his hobby either. He was a little unique and all of that. In 1869, when he's 11, father decided that he would take all 4 of his children on a grand tour of Europe. And they were gone for a year. They went to England, France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. Just an astonishing, eye-opening experience for him as a young man. He came back. He had had several asthma attacks on the trip, and his father had to cancel plans occasionally to care for Theodore. By the way, he hated Teddy. Everybody calls him Teddy, but he didn't like it. So when they came back from this tour, his father said, Theodore, you have a brilliant mind, but you have a very frail body. You need to make yourself physically. And his father didn't force this on him, but his father said, I'm going to hire somebody, if you would like, to come in every day and begin to give you an exercise discipline. And after a month or two of that, he asked his father to actually hire him somebody to give him boxing lessons. And he literally did what his father had recommended. He remade himself physically. So you get to the pictures of him. I showed you the picture of him at 10, and then the picture of him at 17, he's a different person. And he boxed at Harvard. And he did not have much of a temper, but if you pushed him too far, and several times larger students did try and tease him about his glasses, and he was only 5'8". And he would take only so much, and then he would stand up and usually put them on the floor with one punch. 1872, just 3 years later, father decides he's going to take the whole family, 4 children and his wife, on another trip abroad. This time they go to Egypt. He gets to go up the Nile and see the pyramids and Abu Simbel, to Palestine, to Greece, and then back into Germany. And his parents and his older sister went off on their own and left him with Elliot and Corinne, his 2 younger siblings, living with families in Dresden for 4 months, and he became fluent in German. He was 14. And it's just after the Franco-Prussian War, just after the unification of Germany. He comes back home from the second European tour, and his father and he have decided that, yes, he would like to go to Harvard, and he's behind. He said, my French and my German are very good. I can get along in Italian. I'm weak in Greek and Latin. And if I'm going to go to Harvard, I need a tutor to help me with those. He said, and I'm kind of weak in mathematics. So he spent 3 years being tutored at home in those subjects, because there was an entrance exam for Harvard that you had to pass to get in. After 3 years of intensive study in the areas that he knew he was weak, passed the entrance exam with flying colors. Yeah, he already spoke French, German, and some Italian. He lamented that he was weak in Latin and Greek and mathematics. But 1876, he passed the Harvard entrance exam. But he was an odd duck at Harvard. Most of his life, that would be a phrase that applied to him. Nobody really knew what to do with him. He'd been homeschooled up until the time he entered Harvard. And so there is more than one anecdote about him interrupting his professors during their lectures with questions and comments and corrections and supplemental. And one professor finally said, Mr. Roosevelt, would you please be quiet and let me teach the course? It is, after all, my course. I identify with that. I had a professor that actually did that to me in a seminar I was in grad school. He fussed at me. He says, Rob, he says, you have to let me say something every now and then. While he's at Harvard, he's 20 years old and a student. He got word from his family that he needed to come home, that his father was deathly ill. And before he got home, his father died. And it devastated him emotionally, because he absolutely adored his father. He idolized his father. He said for the rest of his life, he often faced a problem or a question, and he would ask himself, what would my father tell me to do? That was his guiding star. And so, he almost dropped out. The parents, or his mother and his siblings, persuaded him, no, you have to go back and finish. But he was pretty shaken by the death of his father. And as he went back to Boston, he began a 2-year courtship with Alice Lee, who was a Boston debutante, a couple of years younger than him, but she had a brother at Harvard, and he visited the family and met her. And she laughed at him, and he kept proposing marriage, and she kept saying no. She said no for 2 years. And finally, he wore her down because he was Teddy Roosevelt. And they got married, fabulous wedding. He graduates school. He comes back. Oh, they did do a honeymoon in Switzerland. So, I mean, he's very well traveled. He's probably better internationally exposed and traveled than any president we had ever had up to that point. And he started law school. And he hated it. He said what many other people have said. He said, law school is just learning the art of selling justice. He said, and I hate the work. And he says, now politics interests me. And he started hanging around with some of the political parties in New York, which people from his social strata never did. Politics was like, for the Irish immigrants and the people on the streets, politics was a demeaning profession. You shouldn't have anything to do with them. Well, one of the political movers and shakers, one Irish cigar chomping, whiskey drinking guy, saw this young Harvard grad in his early 20s and said, how'd you like to run for legislature? And he got elected. He dropped out of law school, he ran for the state legislature, and he won. And at the legislature, he was an odd duck. It's going to be a repeated theme. He was 24 years old, and he's been elected to the New York State Legislature, and he walks into committee hearings and stands up on the floor and gives speeches, and he expects everybody to listen to him because he considered himself smarter than 90% of everybody else in the legislature, and he may have been right. So they're one-year terms at this point. He's elected to a second one-year term and then a third one-year term. In his second one-year term, he was elected minority leader. The Republican Party were not in the majority in the legislature. He was not part of Tammany Hall, but he gave them fits. In 1883, Alice announced she was expecting. TR bought 155 acres on Long Island and planned a 12-bedroom house. Thank you very much. He said, I'm in favor of a large family. So from the get-go. And he had the money. He'd already inherited his share of his father's estate. He had 3 siblings, but the family were extremely well off. So yeah, 155 acres, and he's going to build a 12-bedroom house. And of course, they have a house in the city as well. He did rent rooms in Albany. He'd go up for the legislative sessions during the week, take the train home for the weekends. February 13th, Alice gave birth to their first child. He's in Albany, gets a telegram, says it's a girl. And then later in the day, gets a telegram that says, come home immediately, Alice is fading. And his mother is sick upstairs with typhoid fever. He arrived home, and through the night, early the next morning, his mother dies, and 3 hours later, his wife dies. And he is, at this point, devastated. His brother, Elliot, said, this house is cursed. And he made a single entry in his diary for February 14th, 1884. He said, the light has gone out of my life. And he put a big black X. He's 26 years old. He's already, he's a Harvard grad. He's been in the legislature 3 terms, 3 one-year terms, recognized now as a leader. First child has been born, but his wife and his mother, his father had died while he was in college, and now his mother has died, and his wife, whom he adored. He never mentioned her again. The daughter was named Alice, and he had a hard time calling her by her name for many years. He could not face New York. He could not face living in the house. When the legislative session was out in June, just a couple of months later, he told his sister, sell the house, and I'm leaving. I'm going out west. So he went to the Dakotas. He had already been there. It was not unfamiliar. He had been to the Dakotas because he liked adventure. He liked hunting. He'd been out and shot a buffalo and camped in the wilderness. He'd talked to ranchers and cowboys. He'd actually bought some cattle and had somebody managing them for him because he's rich enough to dabble. And nobody owned land in the Dakotas. It was all government-owned land. So you essentially were squatting and grazing your herd on government land. But it's what everybody did, and with thousands of cattle, you could make a go of it. But it was a rough life. The winters in the Dakotas are harsh. He built Elkhorn Ranch, invested in cattle that could be raised on the open government range. Yeah. No. He left his daughter Alice, his newborn daughter Alice, he left with his sister. We'll come back to her. She's a character. She inherited a lot of his characteristics, and with her upbringing, you can imagine. He hired cowboys to help him with his cattle, and as always, he was an odd duck. He was the city slicker, 5'8" and about 140 pounds, and again, big old rough, tough cowboys. There's more than one account that runs basically the same way, would come in and tease him and make fun, say, oh, Four Eyes is buying the drinks for everybody. And he would sit there for a while, and they would the guy would continue to tease and insult him, and he would stand up and drop him with one punch. Because he'd had boxing lessons, and he'd learned. He'd learned well. He was good. He packed a punch. So after a while, the cowboys kind of got to like him. They didn't treat him as the dude, old Four Eye. Well, he said he knew he'd been accepted when they stopped calling him Four Eyes, and they started calling him Old Four Eyes. He said, when they call me, if you're old, if they call you Old Four Eyes, you're in. Yeah, his boxing skills from his teenage years in Harvard were useful. He wrote 3 books about Western life. His own days as a rancher, A History of the American West, which is still quite readable. And he went back in 1893 and wrote a 3rd book about the settlement of the West. So now we get a second life. After a couple of years out west, he comes back to New York for a visit. He visits his sister Bamie's house, which is where his daughter is living. And he doesn't realize it. Nobody's really ever owned up to this, but the suspicion is that his sister arranged for Edith Caro to be in the parlor when he arrived. Now, Edith had been a neighbor. They had been friends since they were 4. In fact, the famous picture of him standing at the window watching the funeral procession, she was with the 2 boys. She was with TR and Elliot in the house watching the Lincoln funeral cortege. And I'll tell you a funny story I didn't put in my notes here, but when Edith saw the Lincoln funeral cortege and the procession coming by, she was a couple of years younger than them, she burst into tears, and the boys locked her in the closet. So they had known each other. They had grown up together, and there was a lot of expectation and almost an arrangement before he went off to Harvard. And there's a lot of speculation and some between-the-lines observations that something happened about the time he left for Harvard, and their relationship cooled. And he then, after his father's death, pursued the Boston debutante. So he comes back and meets her by chance in the parlor of his sister, and it's on. It's immediate. They renew the relationship, the friendship, and she basically tells him after a couple of months, I have always loved you. 6 weeks later, they're engaged. Her family had left New York City and moved to England, immigrated. She was about to go with them, and she changed her mind at the last minute and said, no, I think I'll stay in New York for a little while, because she's courting Teddy. But her family is living in London now. So he sails for England to join Edith and her family, and they're married in London, December 1886. He's 28, Edith's 25. You can visit the church. There's a plaque where he was married in London for his second marriage. Daughter Alice, by his first wife, joined by a son from Edith in 1887, and then another son in 1889, another daughter in 1891, another son in 1894, and another son in 1897. So there's his family. He didn't get to 12, but he said there is nothing quite so entertaining, amusing, and wonderful as a household full of children. And the 155 acres along Long Island was their paradise. They rode in Long Island Sound, they rode horseback, they hiked, they did archery, they did athletic contests, and he romped with the kids. He was their playmate. Edith actually is said to have told someone in the White House when there was a huge thump from an upstairs bedroom, and they were downstairs, and said, yeah, Teddy's really about 6 years old. So in 1888, he's just turned 30. He gave public speeches supporting the presidential candidacy of Benjamin Harrison. He gave up his legislative career in the New York State Legislature when it west, but he's kind of dabbling now. He gets on the campaign trail. And in return, when Harrison won, he named Roosevelt to the U.S. Civil Service Commission, which was supposed to ensure that there was merit in government employees and that everybody wasn't fired just because they were the wrong political party. So Teddy and family moved to Washington. They rented a house near DuPont Circle. And then Harrison lost after his first term. Grover Cleveland, this is the famous split presidency. Until Trump, nobody else had ever done it. Cleveland had been president before Harrison. Harrison beat him. And then Cleveland came back and ran and won a second term. And so he figures, well, okay, Harrison was a Republican, and he appointed me because I'm a Republican. Cleveland's going to fire me. Cleveland kept him on. Cleveland had been governor of New York and knew Teddy from his legislature days. And he kept Teddy on because Cleveland wanted to reform the corruption in U.S. civil service. Served on the commission then for 6 years through 2 presidential terms, 2 different parties. The family spent summers at Sagamore Hill, Long Island. So in Washington in those days, all the government employees took a lengthy summer vacation, usually 2 or 3 months, and they would all go back up to Long Island Sound to their acreage. In 1894, the new mayor of New York asked Teddy to head the Board of Police Commissioners. So he left the civil service, moved the family back to New York, and they bought a house in New York City to go with the estate on Long Island. And I'll give you a little background about New York in the 1890s. Jacob Riis, very famous photojournalist in the history of American journalism, he took pictures everywhere. This is, a generation or so after Brady and the other great Civil War photographers. So the idea of news photography is just burgeoning. Riis published a book of photos about the poor in New York City in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives. And it just sold like hotcakes. He went through the tenements and photographed the ethnic immigrant households and sweatshops and people working in their homes, and was trying, he as a muckraker in the best sense of the word, he wanted there to be reform in housing and sanitation and healthcare for the poor and the immigrant communities in New York City. Roosevelt loved the book. The police department is notoriously corrupt from top to bottom. TR visited Riis's office and left a card with a note, "I have read your book and I have come to help." And he meant it. On his first day as police commissioner, he invited Riis to visit him in his new office. They walked up the stairs. He turned around and said, "Okay, what do we do first?" Because Riis knew, and Riis took him on a tour. Riis gave him a grand tour of the Lower East Side, briefed him on all the immigrant communities, and briefed him on police corruption. Said, the police chief is corrupt, and I can give you the names of 3 or 4 guys whom I would trust, but don't trust anybody else. And Roosevelt demanded and got the resignation of the police chief, and then in the first year he fired 200 officers for dishonesty and incompetence. And the stories about him going out at night and checking patrol areas in the middle of the night, and if he caught a police officer not in his post or asleep, fired him on the spot. And he single-handedly reformed the New York police force. He was instrumental in founding the first police academy, the New York police force, because he said, we need to train officers, and we need them more professional, and we need to cover ethics. So now we get to 1896. The Republican presidential candidate is now William McKinley. And TR, he's police commissioner in New York, but he's campaigning. He's campaigning throughout New York, in the city and then the upstate boroughs. He's campaigning in New Jersey, in Connecticut, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. He goes out on the road because he has turned into quite a convincing orator. And after McKinley wins, he asked Teddy, what do you want to do? And Teddy, going back to his days as a student of U.S. naval history, said, I want to be the Navy Secretary. And McKinley says, well, you're not quite old enough for that, but I can make you the Undersecretary. I can make you the second in command. So he's appointed Undersecretary of the Navy in early 1897. And he'd always been a supporter of the U.S. building a large Navy. This is the Industrial Revolution, the idea of building large iron steamships, equipping them with high caliber cannon. We were kind of late to the party. The European powers had already been doing it in America. Most American political figures had never seen a real need for the U.S. to have a fleet that competed with the British or the French or the Germans. Teddy said, no, we need a fleet. And trouble was brewing right next door. Cuba, still a Spanish colony. The Spanish governor was a cruel man. He attempted to suppress a rebellion by burning the countryside. Tens of thousands of people died of starvation. There was a lot of press coverage in the U.S., and it became more and more of an issue in the United States public opinion. McKinley warned the Spanish that they needed to fire this governor and send somebody new, that it was becoming very unpopular, and there was pressure on him to intervene, and he didn't want to. He sent a U.S. battleship on a goodwill visit to Havana, and he warned the Spanish that the Maine was there to protect Americans and their property in Cuba. And February 15th, 1898, this is a year after Roosevelt gets his position as Undersecretary, the battleship Maine exploded and sank in Maine Harbor. 10 days later, the Secretary of the Navy has a dental appointment. While he's out, he leaves Teddy in charge. Teddy immediately dispatches dozens of telegrams to various naval commands: buy extra ammunition, increase coal stocks, rent extra cargo ships, station warships close to Cuba. He cabled Admiral Dewey, the head of the Pacific Fleet, assemble your fleet near the Philippines, be prepared to attack the Spanish fleet there. The entire U.S. Army was only 28,000 men, but we'd already started to build a big fleet. So the Secretary of the Navy came back from his dental appointment and said, what did you do? He read through all the telegrams and he says, well, okay, that's probably all the right things to do, but he was kind of a courtly, slow move, and Teddy was like, no, there's going to be war. We're going to have to do something. So U.S. newspapers demanded that we retaliate for the Maine. April 11th, McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war. We only have 28,000 men in the Army. He calls for 125,000 volunteers. So he wants to quintuple the size of the Army, including 3,000 cavalrymen. May 10th, Roosevelt resigns, joined the U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel. He wants to command, or at least be second in command, of one of those 3 volunteer cavalry divisions. And Roosevelt and his friend, Dr. Leonard Wood, who'd had a career in the Army, he was a medical doctor, but he was also an infantry general, they organized and recruited one of the 3 volunteer cavalry divisions. Roosevelt recruited from his wealthy friends in New York, from his Harvard classmates, and also cowboys from the Dakotas. Really interesting mix of people. So the volunteer division included 8 Western sheriffs, a Pawnee warrior, and an unreported number of Western outlaws, including one guy whose father had been in the Jesse James gang. Now, there wasn't anybody in the Rough Riders who had been in Jesse James' gang, but it was the son of somebody. Yes, the unknown number of Western outlaws. May 1st, the Pacific Fleet got into the first blows. They attacked the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, won an incredible, decisive victory, sank all the Spanish ships in the harbor in Manila. It's the famous, we have met the enemy and he is us. The volunteers set sail for Cuba in June. Roosevelt led his men in battle, first skirmish. He leads a charge. The Spanish retreat. 9 days later, the last redoubt over the harbor of Havana San Juan Hill, and Roosevelt leads the charge. Men are killed on both sides of him. About 100 people in the division were killed, and Leonard Wood had actually been detailed to another position, so Teddy was in charge of the cavalry division that day. He won the battle. The New York papers loved it. They have reporters in Cuba. They're telegraphing back stories, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and they've got photographers. This is the Rough Riders. The day after, they staged this the day after the battle. There's Teddy with a red shirt on. There's some speculation that whoever colorized this might not have got that right, but this is the original black and white. And this is the Rough Riders by Teddy Roosevelt. He becomes famous. I mean, he's already sort of known, especially police commissioner in New York City, but now he's a war hero. And the papers in New York have him on the front page. 2 weeks after arriving back in New York from Cuba, the Republican Party nominated him for governor. So this has all happened in one summer. He comes back in early September. By mid-September, he's running for governor. He campaigns. He gave 20 speeches a day in the 6 weeks between his nomination and the election day. 1.3 million votes cast. He won by 17,000 votes. And he's now the governor of New York. Catapulted. Sworn in December 31st, 1898. He promptly asked the legislature to raise corporate taxes and commissioned an investigation into fraud in the operation of the Erie Canal. And his Republican allies, the party bosses who elected him, went berserk. They're like, you're not supposed to do that. The corporate companies are the ones who have been funding us. They funded your candidacy. He says, I don't care. He says, they're corrupt, they're going to jail, and we need the money. And if the operation of the Erie Canal, if people have been corrupt, then they're going to jail. And he's just, I mean, you know, he's been known to tear the leg off a chair and beat the desk with it. His Republican allies were furious at him. As soon as he's governor, he's not going to be a do-nothing caretaker. In 1899, President McKinley's vice president died in office. McKinley's going to run for a second term. Roosevelt had gotten into the Department of Navy because he campaigned for McKinley in 1896. He's going to run for re-election in 1900, but his vice president has died. He's going to have to pick another running mate. The Republican bosses and said, we have an idea. Would you please get Teddy out of here? We would like for Teddy to go be vice president and not be governor of New York anymore. And it works. They actually organized delegates behind his back, pledged to vote for him for the vice presidential nomination. He didn't know about it, and he didn't want to do it. He said the vice presidency is a dead-end job. There's nothing to do. And vice presidents, it's usually the end of their political career. Always has been. Yep. Even if Roosevelt didn't want the nomination, they voted him in. He reluctantly agreed. McKinley wasn't sure he wanted him either. McKinley's like, this is a crazy man. I'm not sure I want him as my vice president. He campaigned ferociously. Presidential candidates in those days did not campaign. They stayed home. They hosted reporters. They issued statements. Roosevelt went out on a whistle-top tour, 21,000 miles, 24 states, hundreds of speeches, and they won the election in a landslide. There's the poster. He's 39 years old. McKinley was a Civil War veteran, World War II. Or no, World War II, Civil War. Civil War veteran, yeah. For president, for vice president. So McKinley, sworn in as president and vice president in March of 1901. Roosevelt presides over the Senate, the duty of the vice president. They met for 5 days and then adjourned. And he's like, now what do I do? It's the only official task that the vice president has, and they've adjourned until September. It's like, okay. So went back to Sagamore Hill, reading, writing, sailing, romping with the children. In the fall, he says, let's go hiking. Takes him up to the Adirondacks in upstate New York. And in September, on the 6th, McKinley is shot in Buffalo, New York, while Teddy is off in the wilderness camping. And 8 days later, he dies of infection from his wounds. Roosevelt is sworn in as the 26th president of the U.S., 42, 6 weeks before his 43rd birthday. It's the youngest president we've ever had. Now, Kennedy was the youngest one elected. Roosevelt was the youngest one sworn into office. And the newspapers, although they had lauded, the New York papers had lauded him, the rest of the press, Boston, Washington, Philadelphia, they were considerably more skeptical. They referred to him for quite a long time as his accidency. Because they didn't think he had any business at 40-something being president. He didn't have the experience. He'd been, what, 2 years governor of New York? What does he know? Well, trust busting and the Pure Food and Drug Act were first-term accomplishments for the first time. The federal government can only apply to interstate commerce, but because of some of the muckraking journalism that was going on, really because of Sinclair Lewis's novel, The Jungle, about the meatpacking plants in Chicago, Teddy says, I have one of my causes. We're going to regulate that and clean it up. Conservation. 150 national forests, 5 national parks. He started the national park system. He wanted the beauty of the West especially preserved. Yosemite and Grand Canyon both, I think, were 2 of the ones that he established. In foreign policy, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the first American to win a Nobel Prize of any discipline. He won the Nobel Peace Prize because he mediated the treaty ending the war between Japan and Russia. He invited the Russians and the Japanese to both come to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he negotiated a peace treaty, and was nominated for and won the Nobel Peace Prize. And yeah, his foreign policy, he's famous for walk softly and carry a big stick. And he, in conjunction with one of the leading naval theoreticians, Mahan, said we needed a 2-ocean navy to protect our shores, we need to protect our harbors, and we need a canal connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific. So it became one of his goals to see, the French had already begun construction and abandoned. The French works had been halted, and they were sort of for sale. And so he intervened. It was going to pick up the contract and the rights that the French had negotiated with the South American country of Colombia, which controlled all of that territory. And the Colombian legislature wouldn't ratify the deal. They wanted more money, and a number of them wanted bribes. And he said, oh, we're not doing that. He sent a gunboat in and had a Panamanian doctor who he'd been in contact with. His wife sewed a flag. They raised the flag. The American gunboat kept the Colombians away, and they recognized the state of Panama and immediately ratified the treaty. And his attorney general is supposed to, he asked at one point, was all of that legal? And his attorney general says, oh, Mr. President, I don't think such a magnificent accomplishment should be tainted by any hint of legality. Senator Hayakawa from California, when we came to negotiate giving the Panama Canal back to Panama, opposed it. And he gave a speech, very famous observation on the grounds that we stole it fair and square, we ought to keep it. And that Teddy would have said, absolutely, that's exactly the idea. He ran for re-election in his own name in 1904. He carried 32 states in a landslide, 7.6 million votes versus 5.1 million for an unknown that nobody remembers. And he loved being president. 100 times a day, the president will laugh, and when he laughs, he does it with the same energy with which he talks. It is usually a roar of laughter, and it comes nearly every 5 minutes. And it's always followed a few minutes later by, come, gentlemen, let us be serious. That was sort of the way he lived his life. I'm going to race through this. For his presidency, much more is known, and it's easier to get a handle on. But presidential first. He's the first president to travel outside of the U.S. while in office. He visited Panama after we'd resumed the construction there. He's the first president to fly in an airplane. The Wright brothers have done their flight. Wilbur takes him up in an airplane, and he loved it. He's bullish. It's great. We need to buy more of these. First American to win a Nobel Prize. First to dispatch an American fleet around the world. But after his reelection in 1904, he had sort of on the spur of the moment, because no president since Washington had ever served 3 terms. He pledged after he won that second term, because he'd served 3.5 years of McKinley's term. He said, I will not run again. And then he regretted it. So he came to the end of that second term, and there really wasn't anybody else to pick up the mantle and continue his policies. He had a Secretary of War, William Taft, who was 300 pounds, and he and Teddy would wrestle sometimes on the second story and make the house shake. But Taft was very methodical and slow, and he liked poker and whiskey and cigars, and didn't really want to trouble himself to make a lot of effort towards running things. But Roosevelt endorsed him and decided he would make a long desired safari to Africa. He went with 275 porters and 15 armed native guards and his son Kermit. Almost a year, they collected 12,000 specimens, mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, insects, shipped them all back to the States. Most of the New York City Museum of Natural History is stocked from Teddy's African safari. He's 51 years old, and he's an ex-president. I don't know how you guys feel, but 51 is a spring chicken. 51 is still young. What's he going to do with himself? And he's lived this incredible life already. He's been a cowboy in the West. He organized a cavalry division and fought in a war. He's been governor of New York and police commissioner in New York City and president for 8 years. What's he going to do now? Toured Europe. Edith and Ethel joined them in Egypt as they're coming out of Africa. When he returned to the U.S., he was dismayed and disappointed in Taft. There'd been a great deal of labor unrest, strikes, violence. Roosevelt called for reform and better conditions. Taft did nothing. Roosevelt finally says, okay, I'm going to oppose you for the Republican nomination in 1912. And he enters the primaries and wins, but the Republican Party selected most of their delegates from party insiders and governors and state legislators. And so at the nominating convention, Taft is renominated, and Teddy and his supporters walk out and say, fine, we'll start a third party. And they found the Progressive Party. So now we have a 3-way race. At a campaign rally in October in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he was shot before the rally. The bullet flew by his eyeglass case in a 50-page speech, because he's Roosevelt. He insisted on giving the speech. They said, no, we got to take you to the hospital. He said, no, I'm going to give the speech first. He does. He actually opens his suit jacket, and you can see that the blood has soaked through his vest. He's got a big red spot. And he says, I'm going to deliver the speech, then I will go to the hospital. Only after the speech. So it's Taft versus Wilson versus Roosevelt. It's Republicans and Democrats and this new party, which the nickname of the new party was the Bull Moose Party because of Teddy. Taft finished third. He's the sitting president running for re-election. He gets beat by Wilson and Roosevelt both. They each have more votes than he does. Roosevelt finished with 4.1 million votes, Taft with 3.5 million, but Wilson won 6.3. So it was a split, and the Democrat was elected, and Woodrow Wilson becomes president. Teddy's lost. And now what is he going to do? He's going to go explore the Amazon. I mean, what else? He'd heard about the River of Doubt, which everybody knew its origins along the Andes. It flows north. Nobody knew. They suspected it joined the Amazon somewhere, but nobody had ever been down the river. So he and Kermit and a party of 22 paddlers and 7 dugout canoes are going to take the River of Doubt down and trace it into the Amazon, and it goes badly. They ran low on food. Roosevelt fell ill with a fever. He's injured. Kermit fears for his life. After 48 days, they reach the Amazon. They've lost 5 of their 7 canoes and half of their paddlers. He returned to New York in 1914. He was worn out. His health was permanently damaged by his experience there. Of course, 1914 is the year that World War I begins. I'm not going to rehearse all of that because indulge me for a few minutes if you would. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia declared war on Austria. Germany declared war on Russia. France declared war on Germany. Germany invaded Belgium. England declared war on Germany. Now it's everybody. 1916, Wilson runs for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And then he promptly gets us in the war. Because in 1917, Russia drops out. The Tsar is overthrown, and the Russians sue for peace. Germany announces unrestricted submarine warfare, sinks 5 U.S. ships in British waters the first week. And Wilson asks for a declaration of war. Roosevelt decides, I can raise a volunteer cavalry division. Which is like, everybody's going, oh, please no. It's the last thing we need is Teddy Roosevelt leading a cavalry charge across toward the German trenches and the machine guns. These are not the Spanish in Cuba. You know, you will all be killed in the first 3 minutes. And so Wilson actually issues a command to the army. He says, under no circumstances is any army recruiting station allowed to enlist Theodore Roosevelt. Under no conditions. But his daughters and his sons all do enlist. They all fight in the war. Kermit fights with the British Army against the Turks. Archie fought with the American Expeditionary Force in France. Ted Jr. was in the trenches with the AAF and the front lines. And Quentin, the baby of the family, is 21, became a pilot. And he was shot down and killed in November of 1918. And that broke Teddy, his baby, his youngest son. 6 weeks after the end of the war, only a few months after Quentin had died, he died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill. Archie, home on leave, cabled his brothers, the old lion is dead at 66. We actually have some newsreel footage. I won't play it for you, but that's newsreel footage of his funeral, a little church near Sagamore Hill, and he's buried in the cemetery near the house, near the acreage. Still, that's his burial spot. And I'll finish with this. W.B. Du Bois, who's one of the founders and leaders of the NAACP, a great leader in black education and in civil rights, lobbied for voting rights for the black citizens throughout the U.S., fought against Jim Crow, fought against lynching. Here's what W.B. Du Bois wrote a month after Teddy Roosevelt's death in the NCAAP journal on the front page. Take him all in all, he was a man. Generous, impulsive, fearless, loving the public eye, but intent on achieving the public good. And because he was thus so splendidly human, even his detractors admired him, and his friends could not eulogize him too highly. We mourn with the rest of the world, as is fitting, but there is too in our sorrow of quality peculiar and apart. We have lost a friend. That he was our friend proves the justice of our cause, for Roosevelt never championed a cause which was not in its essence right. He had his faults, of the head, not the heart, but we knew and we know that he believed he was right, and he of all men had to act in accordance with his beliefs. It is good to remember that in 1917 he justified our trust when at the time of the East St. Louis riots about 40 black people were killed. Because of the migration from south to north, there was a lot of labor unrest and pressure because large numbers of black people from the southern states were moving to the northern states, and in East St. Louis in Illinois, oddly enough, it was a huge riot, at which almost a pogrom, where hundreds of black immigrants from the South were attacked and injured. Almost, I think 40 of them were killed. And in a speech in Carnegie Hall, Roosevelt had stood up and denounced it. It was at a labor speech, and the labor unions were trying to protect their labor members who were opposed to this black migration. And Roosevelt stood up and got booed by saying this was wrong. So, 1917, he justified our trust when at the time of the East St. Louis riots, he alone, of all Americans prating of liberty and democracy, uttered his courageous pronouncement at the meeting in Carnegie Hall. Justice with me, he shouted, is not a mere form of words. Okay. Wow. Thank you for indulging me. I was afraid I was going to go a little over because and I left out about 1,800 of the 2,000 pages. Here's what I want to do this fall. I've thought about this for a while, and I want to go back to an earlier time. I want to go back to Europe. I want to talk about Erasmus next month, Desiderius Erasmus. The short version of him is Erasmus is the man who laid the egg that Luther hatched. Erasmus is a scholar. He mastered New Testament Greek. He satirized the church. He wrote, vicious, cutting satire. And he longed for a return to simple Christianity. And in many ways, he is the immediate predecessor to Luther. He's the man who laid the egg that Luther hatched. And then we're going to go in November and talk about John Calvin. Quiet, modest scholar, loved the classics and classical language. He was working as an editor for the press of Johann Froben in Basel when he was recruited over his objections to reform the church in Geneva. He was threatened. He said, if you go back to Basel, God will curse your quiet scholarly life. You have to stay here in Geneva and help me reform the church. And then finally, in December, I want to talk about Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor in Geneva. And he's a young boy from a minor noble family, recognized as a brilliant scholar at a young age. He published a volume of poetry at age 28, which made him famous. He was considered one of the best writers of Latin poetry of his time. And then he gave it all up and moved to Geneva. So I want to talk about those three gentlemen over the next 3 months. So we're kind of doing the French side. Actually, so 2 of these 3 lecture figures are French, 2 were trained as lawyers, and 2 studied at the University of Paris. And I'll leave it to the lectures to give you all those details. So that's what I want to do over the next 3 months. And I hope you'll come back. That October is the only one that's not the first Tuesday or the second Tuesday of the month. That's the first Tuesday of the month. So October 7th, November 11th, December 9th. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.